This is the Debunking Economics Podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
The Archives.
Episode 36, Lies, Damn Lies and Employment Statistics.
Hello once again, I'm Phil Dobbie. Welcome to another Debunking Economics Podcast with Professor Steve Keen. Today, lies, damn lies, and employment statistics. Now, if you believe the data, the unemployment rate in the United States with figures out last week is 4.5%. Less if you're white and 15% if you're a teenager. The number of unemployed people in the United States is 7.5 million, and almost a quarter of them have been out of work for more than half a year or more. But look, that doesn't sound too bad, does it? Well, particularly when you look at it as an unemployment percentage, 4.5%. Back in 2009, it hit 10%. And it's been gradually sliding down ever since. So when Donald Trump talks about getting jobs back, what exactly is he talking about? I mean, 4.5% is pretty much as low as the unemployment rate can get. Yet Professor Steve Keen isn't sure those figures are that reliable. So what's the issue? Is it the way they're collected? What is it that makes you think these figures aren't so bona fide?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of this has been a long-term bugbear for me, and I have to say that the Australian Survey Company, I'm trying to think of their damn name right now, but they got so sick of the unemployment stats in Australia being misleading that they started producing their own alternative statistics, which didn't ask people a whole range of punitive questions. Now, imagine you're going off to Centrelink, which is the Australian unemployment agency, whatever the agencies are in the UK as well. And they basically, the whole role of the bureaucrat there is to make you feel miserable. Okay, so have you applied for a job last week? Why should I? There are no jobs in my area. Oh, so you're not unemployed then? Right. No, I want a job. That's what happens. The questions are so loaded to basically penalise the unemployed for not working. I've got a particular personal bone to pick on this one. I've got a sister who ran a Trustworks company for some substantial period. She's in the late 50s, extremely intelligent, capable woman. The business was booming in northern New South Wales, but the debt involved in taking over the building, she had to do at one stage. She decided not to, so she found herself classified as unemployed and required to put in 20 job applications a month.
Right.
How the hell do you put into, even in Sydney, let alone in rural New South Wales? So this sort of thing, this punitive aspect to how unemployment stats are collected, and the fact that the difference between what they get answered and the population changes in the participation rate, this makes it incredibly opaque and quite misleading to trust that data. In America's case, the gap between reality and the reported data is so big now that I'm calling it out, and on this one, Trump is definitely right. There's massive unemployment, hidden unemployment in America, and that people who are being hidden and not being counted by the Democrats, as it happens, they weren't counted by Bush either. Those people are the ones who voted for Trump.
So you're saying, in effect, the participation rate is lower because of those questions that are being asked. It's like, well, you're not really true. You're out of work, but you're not really trying to find a job. Therefore, we'll classify you as not looking, and therefore you're not in the party. You were not going to include you as part of the participation rate. That's what you're saying, in effect.
That's right. Yeah, and also like in America's case, we look at the additional thing: how many people are in prison. It's actually a substantial percentage of the population. So in that case, the participation, they're not unemployed because they're not in the workforce.
Right.
But if you count the population, they're part of the population that doesn't have a job. So these factors, if you're going to piss people off, I can think of no better way of doing it than the recorded unemployment statistics.
But the participation rate in the United States has dropped. So, admittedly, not as much as the unemployment rate, but it's dropped from, so it was 66% of the population was counted as being the participation rate in 2007. It's down to 63% now. So, I mean, it has gone down, but admittedly, it's only gone down 3%, and yet the claim on unemployment has gone down from 10% to 4.5%. So in effect, one of them is halved, the other one's gone down just a little bit.
Yeah, but the participation rate has all sorts of catches to it. And the crazy thing is, rather than saying that these things are tripwires that are there to reduce the actual recorded unemployment level, I've seen economists taking it seriously and wondering what optimal decision are workers making to decide not to apply for jobs right now. Again, that's total ludicrous nonsense. The beauty is that normally you've got to go to Breitbart websites to find stuff to contradict this stuff, or Zero Hedge and so on. And people say, oh, yeah, you can't trust that. I'm staring right now at data from the Federal Reserve Economic Database, FRED, which is a wonderful database I highly recommend people to play with. And I've put together a chart which has on one axis the unemployment rate and on the other axis the employment rate. Now, if one was a fair measure of the other, they'd be basically like a Rorschach plot. The top and the bottom would be actually identical. And there's such a divergence now that it's just screamingly obvious that the unemployment data is fake news. So to give you the figures, before the financial crisis hit, so we're talking about 2000 and I'll get the actual date here, December 2006, the civilian employment rate was 63.4%. And the civilian unemployment rate was 4.4%. Now we go to the other side of the crisis. We know the unemployment rate is pretty much 4.4%, as you said. The employment rate is 60%.
Right.
So 3.4% of the population change. Now, you've got to look at demographic shifts as well, and there's a more specific set of data that relates to people between the ages of 25 and 54. And there's certainly people below 54 aren't retiring, and people below 25 are above 25 are definitely almost all in the workforce looking for jobs, or they're either looking for jobs or they're raising kids. So that's pretty much the choice.
Yeah.
There's huge fall in people who've got a job since the financial crisis, and they have not got jobs afterwards.
Right, and I guess this idea that because it's often used as the argument, isn't it? Where you'll hear people saying, the unemployment's fallen, but part of that, or unemployment's risen, and part of the reason for that is because the participation rate has risen, and that's almost used as an excuse. I've heard that used many times, and yet, why would the participation rate change?
Why? Because voluntarily.
Yeah. I mean, you can allow for it over a period of time because of changing demographics, but to change from month to month or year to year, that is a bit peculiar, isn't it?
It is peculiar. And in fact, the only thing which gives you a reason for a rising participation rate over time, and which would then now be tapering, would be the presence of women in the workforce. If you go back to the 1980s, there was pre-1980s, many less women in the workforce than there are now. And on that basis, if I look at the data for the employment rate in America, if I go back to 1975, for example, which was really that was the beginning of women's lib in that sense, or when it was well and truly established, and women were more and more getting into the workforce. At that stage, the civilian employment to population ratio is 56%. Now, it rose from 56%, it peaked, and by this stage you've got the feminization, if I can use that term, of the workforce would have, by that stage, there's the maximum number of women who would have wanted to get a job and were able to get one would be in the workforce. That was then, the civilian rate in April of 2000 was 64.7%. So you now regard the other roughly 35% of the population that isn't recorded as having a job. They're either children, retired people, or predominantly women taking care of children back at home. So at that stage, the unemployment rate too is 4% in America. So you want to take an absolute peak performance point in the American economy. April 2000 is your peak, and there you see unemployment rate was actually 3.8%, below 4%. It actually got low. It even got lower than that, I think. So you look at it, I'm just flipping along the data. About 3.8 was the minimum. So 60, roughly 60, if the American economy is going gangbusters, 65% of the population has a job. At the moment, it's 60%.
Right. And yet the unemployment rate, we're saying, is 4.5%. So it's actually, not hugely dissimilar to where it was when you said it was going gangbusters. So in theory, we're going gangbusters, but you're saying we're not seeing that in terms of the number of people employed. So isn't that the better measure then? Isn't rather than looking at an unemployment rate, shouldn't we just be looking at the employment rate and just counting actually how many people have a job?
Yeah, that's the more honest statistic. And that's what it really does annoy me, that the unemployment rate is focused upon when there's so many fudges involved in it. And politicians themselves like adding those fudges. So my dear friend Tony Abbott, of course, is responsible for this nonsense that required my sister to apply for 20 jobs a month. Yeah. Now, if you couldn't manage to find 20 jobs for a month, you're working your ass off for no wage. And they say, oh, you're also not unemployed, so you're not going to get unemployment benefits either.
Yeah.
And it is, and it's no wonder the working class is saying up But working class is saying up your ass and voting for Donald Trump's and Pauline Hanson's around the world.
Well, the unemployment rate for black or African Americans has gone from a peak of 17.3% in 2010 down to 7.9% in January 2017. So still higher than the average. But that is a huge drop. So, and yet, maybe a lot of those people are saying, well, hang on a second, this doesn't make any sense because I still haven't got a job. I'm a black, I'm an African American. I'm not seeing this big slide. It's probably because they are not being counted as being in the workforce.
Yeah, again, and this is, if people wonder why they're willing to throw human hand grenades into the electoral system rather than voting for sensible and balanced and responsible politicians. The sensible, balanced, and responsible politicians are citing bullshit statistics and making policy on bullshit data.
But economists do use it, of course. They, it's often quoted. The Federal Reserve is always looking at the unemployment rate when they're looking at it as a driver for inflation. And obviously, the logic here is if there's less unemployment, then that can be a cause of inflation because we've got more people fighting for fewer jobs, so they ask for more, so that creates wage push inflation. That's the logic. So a couple of questions. One, is that logic sound? And secondly, if it looks like it's working at the moment, even though you're questioning the total employment statistics, we are starting to see that unemployment rate fall in the United States, and people would argue that is also seeing a rise in inflation, just as it's supposed to.
But not as much as they thought. And this is my own profession here. I mean, I'm happy to call myself an anti-economist in these circumstances because you simply have to. You can't just use a set of numbers without asking what's the basis of the numbers. And if you think the unemployment rate of 4.4% is a real figure, you haven't taken a good look at the data. Yep. And economists are lazy. Okay, if economists, I usually remember my friends at university would look at and my engineering friends would look at what was being studied in the economic course and burst out laughing. The mathematics was so trivial and simple. And they said, you guys get a degree for that? You should see what we've got to do in engineering or physics. We've got to work our asses off compared to you guys. And frankly, that laziness carries through to how the professional economists behave today, and they don't dive in and look at the data, and they don't check and see, is this a verifiable statistic or is it a bullshit statistic?
That's because
economists are responsible.
That's because if they're lazy, if the engineers are lazy, buildings fall down and bridges collapse. Yeah. Maybe that's part of it. So is it the same issue in the UK then? The unemployment rate is 4.7%. It's been as high as 11.8% back in 1984. It's low, but inflation is also low. In fact, inflation, if it wasn't for the devaluation of the pound, inflation would still be pretty low in the UK. Is that because, again, we are counting, because you're expecting inflation to be rising with an unemployment rate that low. So we've got the same issue here in the UK, presumably.
And not as bad. I mean, in that front, I haven't got them in front of me, unfortunately, so I can't say directly. I might have to take a look at it and maybe put a bit of a post up on my Patreon feed about this later. But the employment stats and the unemployment stats in England are Rorschach plots. From the last time I looked at them, they're very, very similar. So the only thing which I can say, which is a factor there, is that the job employment we're actually getting is a lot of the zero contract hour, very insecure employment. And for that reason, people are not spending as much and the economy is not growing particularly, though you've still got low unemployment coming out of it. So it's certainly, and also QE has probably been more effective here at causing a flow through into domestic spending because the QE has actually created money in England, where the form of QE used in America doesn't create much money. So there is a set of circumstantial reasons as to why unemployment makes more sense in England than it makes in the UK than it makes in America.
But huge structural change going on in the UK. I mean, half the increase in jobs over the last year, half of them, I think we've talked about this before on the podcast, half of those new jobs are people who are self-employed. So we're seeing this big structural shift happening. So it's hard.
And that's also a question. I mean, does that mean you're an Uber driver?
Yeah. And so is it sustainable? Absolutely. So it would be good, wouldn't it, to have some sort of conformity around the world, at least, in sort of peer nations to the United States and the UK. So there's some sort of agreement in how these measures are put in place.
Well, the trouble is, the real beginning of the rot in terms of how we work out these numbers goes back to the 1970s, because the 1973-75 was the period where the global economy really, in my opinion, that's why I marked the transition between a robust industrial economy and a fragile financial economy. That's that particular period. In Australia, for example, which is where I lived at the time, unemployment rose from 1% to 5% across 1974. A huge increase. And America, similar sort of thing. So I'm looking at the American data right now, unemployment that went from 5% to 9% in the space of a year. Now, that's it. So in that sense, it was as severe as the crisis of the 2007 crisis, because in fact the unemployment we have a worse level now if we use the figures that were used back in the 70s. The response of the statisticians and the response of the politicians as well, we've got to disguise these numbers. So the politicians were doing things like encouraging students to go to university, because to go to university you reduce the number of recorded unemployed youth, et cetera, and you get them off the streets as well. And from 73 on, these redefinitions of unemployment began to happen. Now, a colleague of mine in Australia, I've lost touch with him, but a guy called Peter Brain, used to always insist on having his name full name spelt out on name tags, by the way, otherwise he's Mr. P Brain. Peter ran this called the National Institute for Economic and Social Research in Melbourne, and did a very high quality, empirically based mathematical model of the Australian economy. And Peter got so incensed. And I think he said between 1973 and I think 2000, there were about of the order of 20 changes in the definition of unemployment. Every last one reduced the recorded number over the previous number. Yeah. And these are International Labour Organization conventions. So the statisticians have been under pressure from the politicians. They've given into the pressure, and they've redefined this very vital economic indicator in such a way as to reduce the stated number every damn time.
So now, what's the
that's politically charged statistics.
Absolutely, but what's the irrefutable way of doing this then? I mean, except for the fact that some people evade tax. I mean, we could look at tax records, couldn't we? How many people are paying their tax? Therefore, you're paying tax. You've got a job.
You can ask the employers, and this is how the employment data is actually largely produced. It's a different survey, but I think it's actually an OECD survey, where the unemployment's a Bureau of Labour Statistics in America. But they simply ask the factory, how many workers you got?
Yeah.
Now that tells you how many people have got a job.
Yeah, but then in the gig economy and the changing, it's getting harder to measure it that way, isn't it?
That's the trouble. Yeah, the growth in this casualised workforce where people are forced to be their own capitalists. That of course has been another trend which has added to the level of insecurity people feel. If wondering why people aren't feeling like the Jetsons now, apart from the absence of flying cars, a lot of it has to be with how much more fragile employment is now than it was 30 or 40 years ago. Yeah, which we talked about a week or two back. But I'm just trying to find if there's a way that you can say, well, this is the safest measure. Well, again, asking the employers is the way to go about it, because with the gig economy, all you do is add up Uber, how many people are on your database and how many hours are they working. I mean, again, it's possible to do these calculations, and in fact, they're easier to do than the unemployment data, which involves in most cases involves somebody going and filling a paper survey at somebody's house. They're expensive stats to record. There was only a tiny sample. It's much easier to actually get on time if real time data could be acquired from all these companies for their employment virtually on a minute to minute basis. So we're relying upon old fashioned technology to collect unreliable data.
Right. Look beneath the hood and see the real statistics. That's the story, isn't it? And make sure you're looking at the number of people who are working rather than the number of people as a percentage who are unemployed as a percentage of what is a pretty meaningless participation rate statistic.
Indeed.
All right, Steve, good to talk. Talk to you again soon.
Okay.
And just looking at, Jesus Christ, I'm just looking at a graph Steve has sent me from the St. Louis Federal Reserve showing the unemployment to population ratio against the unemployment rate. So the employment to population ratio since 2010 has gone from 58.5% to 60%. So that's just a 1.5% difference. So it's not a lot of extra people employed compared to the unemployment rate, which has gone from 10 to 4.5%, more than half, to 6.5% difference. You've got to see Steve's point on there. There's something not right here, isn't there? Why is there not more made of this, I wonder? Anyway, that is it for the Deep Banking Economics podcast for this time. If you're enjoying it, tell your friends. Get them to subscribe. We'll do another one very soon. I'm Phil Dobbie. He was Steve Keen. Thanks for listening.